June 22, 1941. Odessa, Ukrainian SSR. The dawn broke red over the Black Sea, a color that seemed to stain the entire horizon, as if the sky itself already knew what was coming. The air smelled of salt and oil, mingled with the metallic bite of railway smoke. Along the crumbling edge of the docks, a young woman in a faded brown uniform stood stiffly beside a line of recruits, her hands trembling only slightly as she gripped the worn leather strap of her Mosin Nagant rifle. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 25 years old, history student, mother, sharpshooter. The men beside her sneered in half-concealed amusement, their laughter carried away by the sea breeze. "What's next? Women knitting socks on the front line," one joked, slapping another on the shoulder. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes, dark, calm and unflinching, were fixed not on them, but on the horizon. Somewhere out there, across the border, the Wehrmacht was already rolling forward. When the German invasion began, Odessa trembled under the thunder of artillery. Entire districts were flattened in a single day. Soldiers fled, civilians screamed, and yet here she stood, clutching the same rifle she had used as a teenager in a civilian marksmanship course, the one that had earned her a sharpshooter's badge years before the war. At the recruitment table, the officer barely looked up from his clipboard. "Medical units that way," he muttered, gesturing vaguely. "I'm not here to bandage men," she said evenly. "I'm here to fight." He smirked. "You? Fight?" Her only answer was to chamber around, step back, and take aim at a distant tree stump. The shot cracked through the morning air, one bullet, one clean hole directly through the knot in the wood. The laughter stopped. The officer lowered his pen, squinting. "What did you say your name was again?" "Lyudmila Pavlichenko," she replied. "Sniper." He studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Fine, you'll get your chance." Within days, she was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division, the same unit that would soon be holding the line in one of the most brutal battles of the early war, the defense of Odessa. The first night she went into combat, the world became a bold symphony of terror. Shells screamed overhead, illuminating the sky with flashes of white fire. German infantry moved like shadows through the smoke, bayonets glinting under the moonlight. Pavlichenko pressed herself against the dirt, her breath steady, her finger on the trigger. Her first target appeared at 200 meters, a scout crawling toward a Soviet trench. She exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and the man's helmet jerked violently before he collapsed into the mud. It was over in seconds. Her stomach churned. The weight of what she'd done sank into her chest like ice, but before she could think, another shape appeared in her scope, and another after that. One by one, they fell. By morning, she had 6 confirmed kills. By the end of the week, 14. Word spread through the regiment like wildfire. The girl they'd mocked was out shooting them all. When her commanding officer, Major Petrov, approached her after the skirmish, he found her crouched beside her rifle, cleaning it with quiet precision. "You're calm under fire," he said. "That's rare." "I don't shoot for glory," she replied without looking up. "I shoot because they invaded my home." He nodded slowly. "Then you'll do well here." And she did. For months, Odessa held out against wave after wave of German assaults. Pavlichenko learned to crawl through the mud for hours, to wait for a single shot in perfect stillness. She studied the terrain, memorized the habits of enemy snipers, and began hunting them deliberately. Her comrades started calling her Lady Death. By autumn, the name had spread beyond Odessa. German soldiers began whispering it among themselves, a ghostly figure in the rubble, the woman who could kill without a sound, without mercy. Still, at night, she would sit by the faint orange glow of a cigarette, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The war had stripped everything away, fear, hesitation, even her reflection. But when she raised her rifle again at dawn, her hands were steady, and when the Germans finally broke through Odessa and forced the division to retreat towards Sevastopol, Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not retreat in spirit. She carried her rifle, her records and her quiet vengeance with her, ready to face the siege that would test not only her skill, but her humanity itself. The men who had laughed at her were now asking to fight beside her. December 1941, Sevastopol, Crimean Peninsula. Snow fell like ashes over the crumbling city. The once proud naval fortress of Sevastopol now lay beneath a relentless storm of German shells, the ground trembling day and night. Every building was scarred, every street littered with twisted steel and shattered glass. Yet, amid the ruin, Soviet soldiers dug in, refusing to surrender. Among them, Lyudmila Pavlichenko crawled through the ruins of an apartment block, her rifle strapped across her back, the smell of cordite thick in the frozen air. Her uniform was stiff with dirt and blood, her face smudged with soot. The city was dying, but she was very much alive, a hunter in the ruins. From a collapsed window frame, she scanned the landscape through her PU scope. Across the ravine, German spotters moved between sandbags and stone walls. Pavlichenko studied them the way a surgeon studies anatomy, with precision, patience, and no emotion. Her breath slowed. 1 heartbeat, 2. A German officer lifted his binoculars. Crack! He fell before his eyes even found her position. She shifted slightly, her cheek pressed into the frozen wood of her rifle. Another movement, a sniper, cleverly camouflaged, using the corpse of his comrade as bait. Pavlichenko waited, unmoving. Minutes passed. Then a flicker of light, the glint of a scope. Crack! The enemy sniper dropped. Her spotter, Private Nikolai, exhaled sharply beside her. "That's 27, comrade." She didn't answer. She only whispered, "Next." The siege dragged on for months. Supplies dwindled, rations shrank, and the cold gnawed at the bones of even the strongest men. But Pavlichenko's name began to echo through the trenches like a promise of vengeance. Every confirmed kill was carefully recorded in her logbook. Every bullet she fired carried the memory of Odessa, of the civilians who hadn't made it out. By the spring of 1942, her count surpassed 200. She had become a legend and a target. The Germans knew her by name now. Through intercepted radio, chatter and propaganda leaflets, they began calling out to her directly. "Lyudmila Pavlichenko, come over to our side. We'll give you chocolate and officer's rank." Sometimes the taunts came through loudspeakers at dawn. Other times, over field radios, eerie, mocking voices in the mist. She never replied. Instead, she would whisper to her comrades, "If they know my name, they fear me." One bitter morning, she and her unit were ordered to secure a ridge overlooking a key German supply line. The approach was suicide. Open ground, little cover, constant mortar fire. Still, they went. As Soviet infantry advanced under the roar of artillery, Pavlichenko crawled ahead with Nikolai. The snow clung to their uniforms, blending them into the landscape. Her scope swept the ridge until she saw him, a flash of metal, the faintest movement in the tree line. An enemy sniper, a professional. She knew the duel would come down to seconds. The wind howled. Snow whipped across her face. She adjusted her breathing, letting the rhythm of her pulse sync with the cold silence between explosions. Then she saw it, the tiniest flicker of reflection. She fired. A heartbeat later, another shot cracked back. The bullet struck a rock inches from her head, showering her in splinters. She rolled aside, chambered another round, and waited. Minutes turned to hours. Neither moved. When the sun dipped below the horizon, she took a risk. She set her helmet atop her rifle and raised it slowly above the ridge. Crack! The German took the bait. The muzzle flash gave him away. One blink of light in the growing dark. She exhaled, fired. Silence. When she and Nikolai crawled to the spot after nightfall, they found him, a German marksman, well-trained, with tally marks carved into his rifle stock. He had killed over 40 Soviets. Now he was number 257's. The siege tightened. The losses grew unbearable. Every day more of her comrades fell. Yet Pavlichenko pressed on, colder, quieter, sharper with each passing week. Commanders began sending her to train new snipers, teaching them the craft, camouflage, patience, the art of vanishing after the shot. She watched the recruits, some barely 17, and saw herself years earlier, trembling with determination. "Don't shoot for medals," she told them. "Shoot for the soldier beside you, for the city, for the ones who can't fight back." By May 1942, her kill count had reached 309. The Germans had launched their final offensive. Sevastopol burned. A mortar shell struck near her position one morning, sending shrapnel across her face and neck. Nikolai pulled her from the rubble, his hands shaking. "You're done, Lyudmila," he said, pressing a bandage to her cheek. She tried to protest, but the blood in her mouth told her he was right. She was evacuated by sea the last time she would see the front. As the boat carried her away from the inferno, she watched the coastline fade into smoke and ruin, a graveyard of heroes. Behind her lay her rifle, the weapon that had made her name and nearly cost her soul. Before her lay a new kind of battle, one fought not with bullets, but with words and the weight of legend. July 1942, Moscow, Soviet Union. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and burnt metal. Nurses moved briskly through the corridors, their white uniforms ghost-like beneath the dim bulbs. Lyudmila Pavlichenko lay on a narrow bed, her face wrapped in gauze, the echo of artillery still ringing in her ears. She had survived, barely. Her eyes opened to find a colonel standing at her bedside, cap in hand. His voice was low and measured. "You've done enough on the front, Comrade Pavlichenko. You're more valuable now as a symbol," she frowned. "A symbol doesn't stop bullets." "No," he said, "but it can move nations." Within weeks, the legend of Lady Death had spread far beyond the trenches. Soviet newspapers printed her photograph, the young woman with the steely gaze who had slain more than 300 invaders. Posters bearing her name were plastered across cities in the Union. Follow her example. Defend the motherland. But Moscow had bigger plans for her. In August 1942, she was summoned to the Kremlin and informed of an extraordinary assignment. A diplomatic mission to the West. Her orders to travel to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain as part of a Soviet delegation to rally support for the Second Front in Europe. A sniper was becoming an ambassador, she tried to argue, that her comrades were still fighting, that she belonged at the front, but her superiors insisted. "Your voice," they said, "is now your weapon." September 1942, Washington, D.C. The city was hot, loud, and far too clean. Pavlichenko stepped off the train in her olive uniform, medals glinting in the sun. Around her, journalists shouted questions, their flashes popping like distant gunfire. She understood little of the language, but she recognized the tone, curiosity, skepticism, disbelief. At the press conference, one American reporter asked, through an interpreter, "Miss Pavlichenko, do you wear makeup in the trenches?" She stared at him in silence, the question hanging like smoke. Then, through the translator, she replied coldly, "I wear my uniform. It has seen more blood than your lipstick ever will." The room went silent. Cameras clicked. That single line made headlines the next morning. Over the next months, she toured the country, speaking to crowds in New York, Chicago, and Toronto. She told them about Odessa, about Sevastopol, about the boys who never came home. She stood before microphones, medals heavy on her chest, and spoke in the same steady tone she once used when calling her targets. In Chicago, she addressed a crowd of thousands, her voice rising over the din. "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old. I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think you've been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd erupted. She had become not just a sniper, but a symbol of defiance, a living embodiment of the Soviet struggle. The American press called her the girl with the rifle. The soldiers she met called her comrade. Eleanor Roosevelt herself invited her to the White House. The First Lady took her hand warmly, asking about her family, her training, her comrades. For the first time in months, Pavlichenko allowed herself to smile. She was so young, Roosevelt later wrote in her diary, yet she carried the weight of a nation on her shoulders. Behind the smiles and the applause, however, Pavlichenko felt the weight of something darker: survivor's guilt. Every cheer, every handshake reminded her of the comrades buried in Sevastopol's soil. At night, in quiet hotel rooms, she cleaned her empty hands as though her rifle were still there, still waiting for her. She longed for the front, for purpose, for the silence of the scope. But war had turned her into something else entirely, a myth the world needed to believe in. When she travelled to London later that winter, British officers saluted her as an equal. They asked about her technique, her patience, her uncanny accuracy. One Scottish officer, half in awe, half in disbelief, asked, "How do you endure it? The waiting, the killing?" Pavlichenko looked out over the rain-soaked Thames and answered quietly, "You stop counting hours and start counting ghosts." The men said nothing. They understood. By the time she returned to the Soviet Union in early 1943, she was a global icon. The Red Army welcomed her back, not as a soldier, but as a hero of propaganda, her story used to inspire new recruits, especially women. Across the USSR, thousands of young girls joined sniper schools, their rifles named after her. But Pavlichenko herself never returned to the front. Her injuries, both visible and invisible, had ended her combat days. She trained others now, teaching patience, precision, and the quiet courage that had once defined her. Each time she handed a rifle to a new recruit, she saw herself again. The young woman on the Odessa docks, mocked by men who couldn't imagine. Her strength. They had laughed at her once. Now they told her story to their children. Spring 1943. Moscow, Soviet Union. The war raged on without her. Every morning, Lyudmila Pavlichenko woke to the distant rumble of artillery reports on the radio, the front lines pushing westward, the tide slowly turning. Yet even as the Red Army advanced, the memories she carried refused to fade. Her body had healed, but the war lived in her mind. In the quiet hours before dawn, she would sit by the window of her small Moscow apartment, cleaning her sidearm out of habit, her hands moving automatically. The click of metal, the faint scent of oil. These were her only comforts. When she closed her eyes, she still saw the shattered streets of Sevastopol, still heard the wind whistling through the ruins. The Ministry of Defense often summoned her for speeches, interviews, and propaganda broadcasts. Her face became a symbol, her story a weapon of morale. Crowds greeted her with flowers, young soldiers begged for autographs, and officials hailed her as the pride of the Soviet woman. But when the cameras turned off, Pavlichenko would sit in silence. The applause felt like a storm from far away, loud, blinding, and meaningless. One day, a young trainee from the Central Women's Sniper School approached her after a lecture. The girl couldn't have been older than 18, slender, nervous, eyes full of fire. "Comrade Pavlichenko," she stammered, "how do you know when you're ready to take a life?" Lyudmila studied her for a long moment before answering. "You're never ready," she said softly. "You just stop asking yourself if you should." The girl nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. As months passed, Pavlichenko became an instructor, overseeing hundreds of recruits. Women from every corner of the Union, some farmers, some students, all eager to prove they could fight. She trained them in patience, discipline, and the art of invisibility. "Your rifle is not for rage," she would say, pacing before them. "It's for precision, for balance. Every shot must mean something." They listened, awed. To them, she was untouchable, the sniper who had outwitted Germany's finest, the woman who had become Lady Death. But in truth, the legend weighed heavily on her shoulders. That autumn, she visited the hospital where wounded soldiers returned from the front. Many recognized her instantly, their faces lighting up even as they lay bandaged and broken. One soldier, barely more than a boy, reached out his trembling hand. "You're the one who killed 300 fascists," he whispered. "Because of you, we kept fighting." She forced a smile. "Because of you, we still can." Yet, as she left the ward, her composure faltered. She pressed her back against the cold wall and let the tears fall, silent, unstoppable. The weight of every name, every shot, every ghost came flooding back. Winter 1944. A snowstorm blanketed Moscow, muffling the sounds of the city. Pavlichenko walked through Red Square, the Kremlin lights flickering through the haze. A military parade was underway, tanks roaring, flags waving, the anthem thundering through loudspeakers. She stood in the crowd, unrecognized for once, her uniform hidden beneath a heavy coat. Children pointed excitedly at the soldiers marching by, their faces filled with wonder. She found herself wondering if they would ever understand the price of what they were cheering for. For a moment, she thought of Nikolai, her spotter, who had fallen months after her evacuation. She thought of the ridges and trenches, the faces that had vanished into the soil, and she thought of the laughter on that first day in Odessa when they told her she didn't belong, if only they could see her now. By the war's end in 1945, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was 29 years old. Her record stood at 309 confirmed kills, and countless others unconfirmed. She had received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, along with the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star Medal. But the medals, she often said, did not silence the echoes. At victory celebrations, while fireworks burst, across the night sky, she felt only the emptiness left behind. The world was cheering for peace, but for her, peace meant remembering those who never got to see it. She rarely spoke of her time at the front anymore. When pressed by journalists, she would simply say, "War taught me to value silence." In the years that followed, she returned to her studies, finishing her degree in history at Kyiv University. She wrote papers on military psychology, spoke at veterans' gatherings, and helped organize sniper training programs. She lived quietly, refusing to glorify the violence she had endured. But sometimes, when she walked past young cadets at the academy, she'd see them straighten their backs and whisper in awe, "That's Lady Death." And she would smile faintly, not out of pride, but remembrance, because she knew what they could never truly understand, that behind every legend lies a human being, and behind every kill count lies a graveyard of memory. Kyiv, 1950s. The war was over, but its ghosts had not left Lyudmila Pavlichenko. They followed her in dreams, in the sound of thunder that made her flinch, in the sudden silence between footsteps on a city street. She was no longer the girl with the rifle, no longer the soldier crawling through mud and smoke. She was a historian now, teaching at the university, her voice calm and steady before rows of young faces who had never seen war. To them, she was a relic of another time, a name from their textbooks, sitting quietly at the front of the room. But behind her composed expression lived the same focus, the same unshakable resolve. When she lectured on the great battles of the Eastern Front, her tone would soften just slightly, and those listening swore they could feel the cold wind of Sevastopol through her words. History, she would tell her students, is not written by those who survive. It's written by those who remember. Outside of class, her life was simple. A small apartment, a garden, occasional letters from old comrades. Some of them never wrote back. Too many had been swallowed by the years. Every now and then she would visit veterans' gatherings. They would salute her respectfully, still calling her Comrade Pavlichenko, though most had long since hung up their uniforms. They would share stories, laughter, sometimes tears, the kind that came when silence was safer than words. At one such gathering, an aging colonel raised his glass. "To the woman who taught the world that courage has no gender." The whole room erupted in applause. Pavlichenko smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "To those who didn't need applause to be brave," she replied. The toasts went quiet after that. Years later, she met again with Eleanor Roosevelt during the former First Lady's visit to the Soviet Union. The two women embraced like old friends. "You were unforgettable," Eleanor said warmly. "America still remembers the girl who shamed its generals." Pavlichenko chuckled softly. "I wasn't trying to shame anyone. I just wanted them to fight." They sat for hours, speaking not of politics or propaganda, but of ordinary things: music, family, the strange stillness that follows war. When they parted, Roosevelt wrote in her journal, "She has the calm of someone who has faced death too many times to fear life." As the years passed, Lyudmila's health began to fade. The old wounds never truly healed, and the strain of the war had taken its toll. Still, she refused to live as a symbol. She tended her garden, fed the stray cats that gathered by her fence, and spent her evenings reading by lamplight. She never married. Perhaps the war had taken that part of her heart, or perhaps she had simply given it all to history. Her rifle remained locked away in a military archive, cleaned and preserved, as if waiting for her hands to return. It never would. But sometimes, in quiet moments, she would close her eyes and imagine the cold wood of its stock, the smell of oil and snow, the faint click of the bolt sliding home. In the summer of 1974, the city of Moscow held a ceremony marking the anniversary of the liberation of Sevastopol. Pavlichenko was invited as guest of honor. She walked slowly to the podium, her steps measured, the weight of years upon her shoulders. She looked out over the crowd, veterans, soldiers, children waving flags, and took a deep breath. "When I was your age," she began, her voice carrying softly through the square, "they laughed at me for wanting to fight. They said war was no place for a woman." The audience fell silent. "I didn't fight to prove them wrong. I fought because my home was burning, because the people I loved were dying, because someone had to stand between them and the enemy." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I hope," she continued, "that none of you will ever have to do what I did. But if the day comes when your courage is tested, remember this: the enemy's greatest fear is not your weapon, it's your will." The crowd rose in a wave of applause, thunderous and sincere. For once, Pavlichenko allowed herself to smile fully, not the tight-lipped smile of duty, but the rare human one she had kept hidden for decades. That night, As fireworks lit the sky over Moscow, she sat alone by her window, the light flickering. Across her medals on the table, she picked one up, the gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union, and turned it in her hand. "So many stars," she whispered, "but the brightest ones are gone." She placed it back carefully and closed her eyes. Outside, the echoes of celebration faded into quiet, and in that quiet, for the first time in years, there was peace. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death, the sniper who had once been laughed at for daring to fight, passed away in 1974 at the age of 58. But her story lived on, not as propaganda, nor as myth, but as truth. The story of a woman who defied the laughter, defied the limits, and became the enemy's greatest fear.